So as you can see on this section here, so you've had a look at the two ways. As you can see in the mark scheme here, your response should really be split into a lower class and upper class. So we have a look here. So straight away, that idea of a lower class had long working hours, therefore they had little free time, so they had little participation. Or you could have said that kind of the lower class kind of participated occasionally on things such as kind of festivals or holy days. So that that was the only chance to participate, whereas upper class had lots of free time, which meant they participated more. And then also you've got some other examples there, so you can see how that might work with regard to kind of the importance of applying social class not only to questions on social class but also on questions that are based around the other social and cultural factors. So if we go on to here then, so for like pre-industrial sport, I'll put the social and cultural factors, links to characteristics, social and cultural factors here, characteristics, and then you can see here the importance of class. So pretty much every single social and cultural factor, other than law and order, will have a direct relationship with all of the kind of different social and cultural factors. So really important one there to make sure that we kind of get that idea that social class will have a big bearing on our responses to all other questions involving social and cultural factors. So rather than going through all this, I'm sure that's something you can have a look through. You can have a look at the revision pack as we come back. What I wanted to just go through is have a look at this, because it's quite a tricky question, and I guess it really examined the ability to be able to talk about a social and cultural factor in more detail than just a basic class distinction. So the in focus areas I wanted to have a look at. This is a question. So using practical examples, explain how transport and education affected opportunities to participate in sport in pre-industrial Britain. So if we went down from here then, so what you've got, I thought transport was really important to make sure that kind of if we've got participation as the kind of key focus here, and our social and cultural factor in transport and education, I thought this was really important. So transport, okay, so we're looking at it here. So upper class did have it. For example, horse and cart, which meant they could travel. For example, real tennis courts at the local market town. Lower class did not have it. Did not have transport, so they were limited to travelling by foot. This meant that activities were local, such as mob football. Now that's easy. That's our class distinction there. Now what I really wanted to make sure we did is understand this idea that due to the fact there was a lack of transport, this meant, because it was local, and for example, sports such as mob football were only played in the village. This meant that there were no standardised rules. So because they couldn't travel, there's no point in having standardised rules, because they wouldn't be able to get to the place they wanted to go to play against another village. So what this meant was that mob football had different set of rules, unwritten rules, in each village it was played. Now this is the one that I think is really important if you get a question on transport that's more than kind of 2 marks, and it's this idea that the lack of transport for lower class actually became the basis for some sports. So you had things such as walking becoming pedestrianism. You had watermen becoming going into rowing, for example. So these ideas of kind of things, the lack of transport actually became some of the big kind of participation things for lower class people. Now education literacy, again, pretty straightforward. Lower class have reduced opportunities, so that meant they couldn't play activities such as real tennis because of a lack of understanding of the complex rules, and also a lack of education meant that a lot of activities were cruel and violent, which put people off. So, for example, there you got mob football, there was no murder. Everything in green is application, as the question here said, using practical examples. So that's a really important point. That straight away, as we talked about before, you have to make sure that this was a 5-mark question, and you needed examples to get those marks. So that was why I've kind of separated this focus to make sure we're okay with that. Okay, so if that's kind of our first section done, the next topic area or time period is post-1850 industrial Britain. So if we have a post-1850 industrial Britain, obviously we have huge societal changes at this point. We've got the Industrial Revolution, kind of middle class, kind of ex-public school boys owning factories, which has completely changed this idea of kind of a working class work. So what we did have was kind of in pre-industrial Britain, we had this idea of kind of agricultural seasonal time on farmland, whereas now we're moving to this kind of machine time where we're looking at kind of a mass migration of the lower classes to the city. Okay, so on top of that, we had this idea of the railways emerging, which have then led to this idea of kind of national kind of competitions such as the FA Cup. On top of that, allowing spectators to go and follow their teams, for example, the factory teams. Now, they're two big key changes with regard to kind of society in post-1850 Britain. These are the kind of key things you'd be looking at. I probably should just say on here, there has been nothing so far on post-1850 industrial Britain, so it's really important that we kind of have an understanding of those. So, it's a really important topic. So if you look on here, I'm not going to spend ages going through this bit. I want to focus on a specific exam question that's a little bit more difficult around this area. So if we have a look onto here, obviously the key things now is at the top here, three-class society, which then dictated why people played sport. Okay, so for example, an amateur now, or a gentleman amateur, will consist of the middle and upper classes, play activities such as things such as rugby, for example, lawn tennis, for example, and then on top of that you've got professionals playing activities such as kind of football, association football now. So obviously have a good read through this, use the revision pack after, and let's have a look at some specific kind of social and cultural factors that are not always directly asked for. So if you get a direct question based around a social and cultural factor, it's relatively easy to describe, as we looked at earlier in the webinar when you looked at those comparing the characteristics between pre-industrial Britain and post-1850 industrial Britain. It's a good little comparison set. Now, what I want to do is have a look at this question here. Now, this came up and it's one of those where it didn't directly ask for social and cultural factors. So it was described how the Industrial Revolution affected working class participation in sport in post-1850 Britain. So we've got our time period, we've got Industrial Revolution, and we've got working class participation. This question doesn't tell us exactly what it wants, so what I thought would be really useful is to make sure you have an understanding of some of the social and cultural factors have the scope for evaluation. And what I mean by that is you can have 2 points of view for each social and cultural factor, in fact sometimes 3, which will allow you to hit the mark scheme really heavily on just 2 social and cultural factors. So what do I mean by that? So what you've got is income. So if you look at income first of all here, okay, so the first thing that comes to your mind really is the fact that, because they work in factories, they had income. But realistically, in the early periods, certainly, there was a real lack of disposable income. The lower class people were slaves to the factory. Okay, so it's really important we get that in. So initially, there's a lack of disposable income to participate in sport. Constantly going back to the exam question. Down to here. But we could also flip this over and say that, working class people playing for factory teams started to get this idea of broken time payments, okay, which slowly started to increase maybe above what their wages were. So the broken time payments meant that if they played for the factory football team, for example, they were reimbursed for any time missed during that week. Now, on top of that, you've got time here. So if we have a look at this, so time, from a downside point of view, so from a negative aspect, 72-hour weeks at the start of the kind of Industrial Revolution meant there was very little time or energy to participate in sport. And of course, these long working hours along with poor conditions led to poor health, cholera, for example, in this period. And then the upside, of course, to time is that by the end of the kind of 1850 to 2000 period, there was now this kind of reduction in working hours. So now there was a 56-hour working week that gave energy to participate. On top of that, you had this idea of a Saturday half-day act, which really then did start to increase opportunity to participate on a Saturday afternoon. This question asked about participate, so you couldn't put anything about spectating. And then finally, I'm looking at this idea of transport. Now, the railways meant that, obviously, the first thing that comes to your mind, well, the railways allowed kind of national travel to allow national leagues and national cups to be set up, such as the FA Cup. However, this is talking about more participation, and a really good one to use here is the fact that the invent of the railways allowed kind of factory owners to start to think about this idea of kind of rewarding their workers with seaside excursions. And by doing this allowed the lower class to go and experience something they hadn't experienced before. For example, going to swimming in the sea on these kind of seaside excursions. Now, obviously, you've got other things in depending on how you you're going to apply it, but these are, I mean, look at that and think, from time, by having an understanding of time from 2 points of view, you've got 3 marks. If you have a look onto here, you can see kind of yellow stuff linked to time. So we got down to here, so that's the first one there. Saturday half day act, 56-hour week, increase the time and energy to participate. You've got here the seaside excursions, low wages, and that will give you your 5 marks there. Now, I thought that was well worth showing, just due to the fact that it wasn't directly referencing any of the social and cultural factors, but by having an understanding of 2 in particular, it really is an easy one to get marks on. So hopefully that's helped with regard to exam technique there. So 21st century, I'm going to move through 20th century to 21st century Britain. Now, 21st century Britain is kind of quite different. Obviously, you've got your generic kind of social and cultural factors, talking about kind of how they will influence the society that we're in today, which makes it a little bit easier to apply examples to. So if you have a look through to here, then these are the social and cultural factors down here, and things start to change a little bit. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, rather than focus on a full slide like this, you've got a revision pack after this to go and have a look at, and these are the answers for you to fill those in. But I wanted to have a look at this specific idea because in 21st century Britain, it is really popular in the exam, and I suggest that you are ready for this, because in last year's A-level exam, there was no data question based around 21st century Britain. The data question was based around commercialism in sport. But this is last year's AS paper. Okay, so when you see this, there is this common mistake, that a rumour that went round the kind of PE community, that if you got a data question, it was okay, you were going to get 2 marks if you just regurgitated kind of the statistics in a question. So this one looks at Sport England, measuring changes in participation, and it asks here, so it shows percentage of men and women age 16 participate in physical activity once a week. Now, the question asks you to, referring to the data, analyse possible reasons for the changes in participation rates over this time. Now, of course, as soon as that happens, of course you have to link it to data. You have to interpret the data. But simply writing out statistics gives you nothing. You are not getting any marks in an A-level paper for just giving statistics. Now, I think a couple of the specimen papers gave marks for it, which caused a little bit of confusion. What you need to be able to do is, when you give a statistic, for example, as we can see here, that both by men and women, participation has increased by the end of that period. That's our most basic conclusion to draw. But then what we have to do is start to think, right, interpreting that, we've got the statistics interpreted, that's our first interpretation, and now we need to apply it to the content qualifier. So this is asking us a possible reason for the changes in participation rate. So of course, when we're talking about changes in participation rate, yes, we've got women here, which tells us that one of the social and cultural factors we're going to be looking at will be gender, but there are other ones. So it's important that just because it's giving us men and women, gender is not the only social and cultural factor that we're going to be working on. We do in fact have to make sure that we can start to think about other social and cultural factors and reasons for an increase in participation. On the flip side of that, of course, you can start to pick out other things in this data set. So for example, from 2012 to 2016, there was actually a decrease in male participation in that time period. So we have to start to think about evaluating certain social and cultural factors. For women, of course, we can kind of have a look at this idea that although their participation has increased, it's still way below males. So we have to then start to think about reasons why that might be. So if I take you onto here, I've kind of put in terms of why it might have increased, I've kind of put the social and cultural factors here. So time, having more flexi time, kind of reduced working hours from post 1850, for example, looking at more of a 40-hour week rather than what was a 56-hour week. If we go down to here, more disposable income, which will allow people to take part in sport. If we go down to here, I've put down some stuff on this section. Now people have to take part due to compulsory physical education in school, so that's linked to education. Now, women's kind of participation might have increased due to this kind of real push within society. Sport England, for example, on campaigns such as This Girl Can. This means that there's been kind of more female success. For example, England women's football team, as an example of a sporting example of them, women being more successful. There are an increase in kind of female presenters. For example, linked to gender, Alex Scott on Sky Sports Football, Claire Baldwin within athletics. And you look at that and think, suddenly there is this kind of idea of kind of how gender and how social and cultural factors have influenced participation increasing. I'll put some more onto here because it was still lower, so there are still these stereotypes prevailing from Victorian era really about women playing sport being masculine, etc. So you can have a look at those and take it from there.